You're listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
Good evening. To be trapped inside what you feel is the wrong kind of person must seem like a life sentence of misery, deeply uncomfortable with yourself and often cruelly judged by others. Until recently, I would guess, most people had barely heard of transsexuals. Now they're the social cause of the hour, and the fierce, fast-moving campaign on their behalf, intensified by social media, is a sign to some of enlightened tolerance, to others a collapse of traditional standards. Both the UK and Scottish governments are talking of making it much easier legally to change your gender. The Church of England has told its schools to let boys wear tutus and tiaras. Drag queens are going into primary schools to instruct children on transgender issues. Topshop and other clothes stores are making even open changing areas gender neutral under pressure from transgender activists. There are complicated issues here. How do we define what the true self is? Are we medicalising the complexities of identity and seeking drug and surgery solutions for people who often have a range of difficult mental health issues? Is gender identity formed before, during or after puberty? Does telling children gender is a choice of more than two options, does it solve a problem or create one? When the Tavistock's Gender Clinic opened in 1989, it had 2 child referrals a year. Last year, it had more than 2,000, 366 under 12, some as young as 3. And how far is society going to have to adapt if, for instance, not just changing rooms, but rape centres, domestic violence refuges, presently single-sex hospital wards were to be open to any man who claimed to be a woman? Gender and Identity, the Moral Maze tonight. Our panel, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, Anne McElvoy, Senior Editor at The Economist, Mona Siddiqui, Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at Edinburgh University, and the Chief Executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor. Matthew Taylor is the only member of the panel identifying as male. What's your initial take on this?
I must admit I've avoided this issue. It feels like wandering into a minefield wearing a blindfold. But if I am to find a position to start from, it is that as far as possible we should trust people to make the choices that feel right for them.
Claire Fox?
I honestly think that you should be able to identify as anything you want, and that's, male, female, Marie Antoinette, black, white, whatever. What I worry about is a kind of tyranny that says I have to, and all public institutions have to acknowledge that and recognise it, which I think identify what you want, but we don't have to change in relation to it. And I am nervous about a kind of walking on eggshells issue and a kind of fashion that's inciting the young to see this as the thing to do, rather than it being, as you said, that terrible trapped in a wrong body situation.
Mona Siddiqui.
It is a very complex issue, but I think that if there's one line of thought going through it, for me personally, it's that all minorities have to be protected as much as possible, that we have to try and create a society where, as far as possible, even if we make mistakes, we provide a safe context for people to make their own mistakes, but to have the right to express.
Anne McElvoy.
I think it's easier to establish self-identity as a principle that many liberals would support than it is to work out exactly what follows from it. And that's why what we're looking at tonight seems to be a social, medical, parts clinical and psychological minefield. And that's why we're going to pick our way quite carefully through it, but also to look at what the ethical implications would be across the piece and how that might inform the way governments and the rest of us think about it.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Jane Fay. She's a writer, journalist, campaigner, herself a trans woman, i.e. was born a boy. She works closely with Mermaids, which is the charity set up to help transgender children. It's children that's the area of greatest concern, isn't it? You can have sympathy for cases like yours, but still worry about prepubescent and pubescent children being given potentially irreversible treatment while their gender identities might seem to be in flux.
No, I'm not worried in the slightest, because prepubescent are not given any interventional treatment at all. It's a social transition if they do that, so there's nothing to worry about there. And actually, your chance of getting any sort of interventionist treatment in the UK before you're 16 are virtually nil.
Anne McElvoy?
Tell us a bit about your own experience and what is the sort of moral lesson that you've drawn from that. You've become a campaigner, you're out there in the debate, but if you could boil it down to what's the single biggest moral claim, as opposed to perhaps legal or practical, that you would draw?
It's very, very difficult. I end up coming into this room thinking, it's not about morality most of the time, because I would very much like to do the sort of Julius Caesar thing and go home and just rest. I don't want to be a campaigner, and most of us are not. I did a session earlier this year at Women of the World at South Bank, and I was talking about being an accidental activist. I don't want to be out here campaigning, and what it is about a lot of the time is the fine detail, the nitty-gritty of legislation, and yet we're being told there's an agenda here. It's just, how do we accommodate that legislation within the current framework?
So what about the point when it comes to young people? I think what perplexes a lot of people who are new to this argument is at what stage would you suggest it is reasonable for a young person to make the kind of decision themselves if they wish to reassign gender, not just to identify as one thing or another, and what would follow from it? You mentioned 16 as a cut-off point. That still seems to be a reasonably young point in someone's life where lots of things are in play, lots of things are in flux.
That's interesting, because this is where morality maybe does come into it. First and foremost, there is very much, people keep coming up as though it's irrevocable. So when you're talking about very young children, there is nothing to do there other than support them in whatever identity they have, whilst recognising that identity may change. And I think there's an awful lot of straw men or straw whatever sort of people.
But delaying puberty is an intervention if you're using
Delaying puberty
hormonal
is
drugs
an
to do
intervention. Delaying puberty is an intervention which, with as far as the current state of medicine is concerned, has minimal consequences. And when you say that it's an intervention which perhaps has consequences, I would like those people who try and use that to say, well, if you don't do it and that person subsequently turns out to be trans, you are condemning that person to years of very painful, very expensive surgery. And I'd like people who say that, it's just a regret and there's no consequences, to be there at their bedside when they do that.
I can see that, but don't you think there's also a precautionary principle that we use, particularly when social change happens very fast? And as we know, the numbers of people now either identifying or applying to go through these processes has rocketed upwards. So there might be a case for saying watchful waiting is a bit of a slogan around it, but just slightly, as far as possible, wait and see. Are you sympathetic to that?
It depends when and what you mean by wait and see. First and foremost, the moral issue here, and what is very, very interesting. Let's start with... Sorry, you're going to come in, sorry. Let's start with basic contraception. You know that there are tens of thousands of girls in this country under the age of 16 taking hormones. It's called reproductive contraception. But some of them are taking morning after pill, some of them are having abortions. Every one of those is life-changing, and it has...
Is it really as life-changing?
Well, shall we actually say why they're allowed to do that? They're allowed to do that because we believe they have agency, and we believe in something called Gillick competence, which says that if somebody is competent to take a medical decision, they're allowed to do it. Now, well, let's go with this.
Sorry, Claire Fox.
One of my nervousness in relation to this is the way the Scottish Government have posed it, that one shouldn't dispute the child's view. Now, children... and growing up is notoriously kind of a confusing time. So, when a child says, I am a robot or what have you, you don't just say, yes, you are.
No, you don't.
No. So, in the sense that this discussion's happening, if a child self-declares as in a different gender, do you challenge that? Is it okay to challenge that? Say no.
You support it.
Why do you support that and not the other thing? That's... say, for example, a young anorexic girl that I know would always say to me, I'm fat, look at me, I'm fat. And I'd say, no, you're not fat. It was objectively not true. So we shouldn't have to accept because a child declares that it's true, should we?
No, but you support the child. It's almost a sort of Schrodinger's... support thing here, that what you're actually doing is you're saying, yes, we accept what you're telling us, we support you. But when a child is 4, what are you doing? You're saying you want to be called this, you want to wear your hair long. There is no great downturn to that. When they reach 10 or 11, and this is part of the expert the expert material, if you like, expert view, dysphoria, if you're going to go down the route, which everyone gets very scared about, of surgery and intervention, will start to manifest itself majorly at puberty. So pre-puberty, there's not a lot to do.
I suppose the reason why this concern comes up, because it seems, as I've said, there's a demand. You will know this, that people, for example, can be really called transphobic if they misgender, or if they say, well, by the way, when you said care, I'm not suggesting that if a child says anything, right, that you're cruel to them. But I'm talking about whole public institutions now saying that things need to be reorganised around, for example, a child saying in a girls' school, I'm a boy, you must call me this name, and you must reorganise around me. That is different than just caring for them, being nice to them.
But it's not reorganisation. Can I just pick up on something else? I think it was you said it, but it might have been Anne, about the numbers coming through. And I mean, part of this, I wish I had transitioned, and there's a lot of people at my age saying, we wish we transitioned a lot earlier. We didn't have the information. Whatever you say the proportion of trans is in the population, whether it's 1% or 0.1%, we don't become it, we don't socialise into it. It's not something you're created. You are trans. That's as far as the medical model understands. If 0.1% of the adult population are trans, then 0.1% of the child population is trans. So what we're actually seeing is beginning to move to the real levels, not a fad.
Jane Fay, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Dr. James Caspian, who's a psychotherapist on the line from Newcastle. He's specialised in clinical work with people considering gender transition, also carrying out research into transsexuals, and particularly into the phenomenon of detransitioning, reversing the whole process. But no more, Dr. Caspian. You're giving the work up. Why?
I must correct you, I'm not a doctor, I'm a psychotherapist.
Oh, right, OK.
It's just Mr. Caspian.
Oh, OK. Mr. Caspian, you're giving this work up. Why?
Well, in 2014, I had a conversation with Dr. Miro Djordjevic, who is a surgeon in Belgrade who does a lot of gender reassignment surgery. And he told me that he'd done 7 reverse gender reassignment operations recently, and he was very concerned because he hadn't seen that number happening before. It had never been researched, so I started to research it. The research has been halted because the university has said I may not continue. However, I did do 2 years of preliminary research before we arrived at that point.
OK, Matthew Taylor.
Mr. Caspian, you would presumably accept that the price that people had to pay in terms of marginalisation, ridicule, from declaring themselves trans was, until very recently, very high.
Well, I've worked for 10 years in a private gender identity clinic, and I've counselled and assessed hundreds of people undergoing or considering undergoing medical gender transition. And in that time I found that people's experiences varied hugely, both socially and psychologically.
So, I'm sorry, are you saying that that there's been no change in public attitudes? Isn't this whole debate only happening because things which until very recently most of society viewed as being exceptional, abnormal, odd, are now being seen as being legitimate and perfectly reasonable choices for people to make? Do you not recognise that shift?
Oh, I can see your point. That's a very valid point indeed. I think as well legislation plays a part in changing public attitudes, probably a huge part. The Gender Recognition Act 2004 and the Equality Act 2010, for instance.
But if that change has taken place, which you recognise, is it surprising that we're now seeing an awful lot more people coming forward and saying, I think my identity and my gender are not aligned?
Well, I'm open-minded. I go on clinical experience, research, and on what people tell me. So I listen to what people tell me and to what people are saying. When I began my preliminary research, I was shocked by what I discovered was happening. I found that, as in my own practice, there appeared to be greater numbers than previously of teenage girls transitioning to be male, having hormone treatment, and some having their breasts removed, double mastectomy, and then numbers regretting and reversing their transitions. So I wanted to find out what they had to say, what their experience was. I
understand that, but do you have a sense? I mean, our previous guest suggested that possibly this is a phenomenon affecting 0.01%, 0.1% of the population. Do you have a sense of what the natural level should be? What the appropriate, in a perfect society, how many people do you think would be feeling that they wanted to be trans.
How could anybody possibly know that? We can't know the numbers of people. There's no research into it. Even if there was research into it, if you did research in, say, one area, say Brighton, you would get a completely different picture to if you did your research in a rural part of Cumbria.
I
mean, you can't possibly know.
I get that. I suppose the question I'm trying to get to here is your desire to focus on the small minority who regret transitioning indicative of a sense that you have that this may not be, as it were, us moving towards some natural state, but some kind of social epidemic?
Well, what shocked me was what I found when I did my preliminary research, because as I say, I go on what people say and on research rather than my own opinions. And what I found was that the young women were saying that they had complex mental health problems and they felt that transition would alleviate them. So there was a lot of self-harm, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, very high rates of autistic spectrum disorder. Actually, amongst people that go to gender clinics, research does show consistently that the rate of autistic spectrum disorder is approximately 6 times higher than in the general population, and we don't know why. Again, we need more research. The regretters and the people that reversed their transition felt that it did not alleviate their problems, and that they saw their gender dysphoria as a reaction to their own histories of, in some cases, sexual abuse, the position of being a girl in society, and that they hated their bodies. And so I was really taken aback because I hadn't realised that anything like that was happening on this scale, which is why, of course, I wanted to do more research into it.
Let me
and
stop
I've
you.
been seeing
Hang on a
more
second.
reports of this nature on a regular basis. So clearly the numbers are going up in this case.
Okay, Mona Siddiqui.
What, in your opinion, are the right reasons to transition?
That's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, you're saying that the research shows that a lot of people are regretting their decision to change their gender or have surgery or have any kind of medical intrusion. But people lead very complex lives, and gender and identity and sexuality are very complex issues. So how does one identify the right reasons for people who want to have who want to call themselves trans or who want to call themselves a different gender?
Well, it's a very complex issue because there's no test. Gender dysphoria, that is unhappiness with one's gender, is the only condition for which a doctor prescribes or performs surgery for which there is no test. It is diagnosed by a self-report from the patient,
but
and
do
there's
you
no
need
agreed
a test? I mean, people can feel all kinds of things about their well-being, their body, their state of mind. And if somebody says that, you know, I don't know, I can't scientifically say anything, but I do know I'm unhappy being who I am, looking the way I look, shouldn't we just take that at face value? Isn't that a moral right that person has? That they're right to express their identity and that complexity of their identity?
Well, I think, you know, as a clinician, I've been concerned with the medical treatment and surgeries that people have gone for. So, I mean, of course, somebody may say they're anything they want to be. They have the right to do that. But we have a duty to do no harm. And so I found a book called Blood and Visions, which was published by a group of young women in the United States who had reversed their gender transitions. And they were saying that they had felt they had been really harmed because when they went to the clinics, and this was in the States where the affirmation model of treatment is practiced widely in clinics, where in some cases teenagers could get hormones on 1 or 2 half-hour appointments and surgeries a few months later without parents' permission. And they were saying that nobody had gone into their issues in more depth with them, that their underlying mental distress and their conflict hadn't been explored.
Mr. Caspian, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're running out of time. But thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme.
Oh, thank you very much.
Our next witness is Professor Stephen Whittle, who's a trans man himself, born a girl, changed gender at 19, he's now 62 I think, and is Professor of Equalities Law at Manchester Metropolitan University and on the line from Manchester now. Professor Whittle, it's not just the obvious physical signs. Males and females, well, according to some scientists anyway, have different brain architecture even. How do you square that with your campaign to make gender a choice, an easier choice, and the person's alone?
I think what's important for us to recognise is that our knowledge of gender and brain sex, as you might call it, has been developing very rapidly over the last 20 years. If you'd said 20 years ago it was impossible to know whether people were really men or women, whatever that means, everybody would have agreed with you. But since then, the science has progressed rapidly. Well, part of the problem was initially research could only be done post-mortem on brains. Increasingly it can be done during life. And what we're seeing now is a lot of work which shows that there is increasingly a recognition that trans people do have brains that better align with the gender they would prefer to be in. But to be honest, I'm a lawyer, and so those things are irrelevant to me. My only concerns are people's rights.
OK. Claire Fox?
I agree that everyone should have equal rights, but I want to explore some of the issues around this. I was kind of a bit bemused recently when Sam Smith, the singer, said when he came out as gender, he basically said, "I love a heel. I've got loads of heels at home," and then started talking about mascara and eyelashes. And do you recognise why some feminists and women's rights campaigners are a bit concerned that in the discussion about transgender, there's a kind of set up femininity there that actually a lot of us gave up a long time ago?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think what's really important is that we recognise there is a huge difference between people's experiences of their genders as an essential part of themselves, and those aspects of themselves which are performativity. They're parts of representations of parts of themselves. So there's a big difference between, for example, lads who go out, like the football on a Saturday, like to go drinking on a Saturday night, etc., and somebody like me who can't possibly relate to that because it has nothing to do with my life at all. I mean, as a man, that I'm not that sort of man.
No, but I suppose that's the thing is I want to look at the atmosphere because you'll be aware of the controversy around recently the male rapist Martin Ponting, who then, once he identified as a woman, Jessica Winfield, was put in a women's prison. But then you've got a rapist of two 16-year-old girls, and the issue is about a trans man going into a women's prison. These things are of some concern. Boys self-declaring as girls, or saying that their gender means that they should go into girls' changing rooms. What do you think of those problems, those dilemmas?
I think you're misframing it. For a start, when you get somebody like Martin, he doesn't just go into a women's prison. It takes a long time. There's a lot of assessment. It's not easy. And similarly, you talk about boys self-declaring. Nobody's going to just self-declare. Nobody does this lightly. But and clearly what's been seen is in the countries which have allowed some form of self-declaration, like Ireland, like Norway, like Malta, like Denmark, it hasn't been an issue. And it hasn't become an issue because we had this problem when we did the Gender Recognition Act. Everybody said, people, it's so easy to get this and anybody can fool a doctor. Everybody will be going off and getting gender recognition so that men can go into women's toilets. No, if men do go into women's toilets, if even they used a Gender Recognition Act to do that, that's about criminal men. It's not about women.
OK, Anne McKelvey?
So, Professor, you're identifying as a trans man. Are there any rights, then, that you think that you wouldn't have or shouldn't have that a biological man would have?
What, that I shouldn't have? I can't think of anything particularly that I shouldn't have that any biological man can have. What I wouldn't expect to do at this stage in my life is to go into women's only space, for example.
Well, that's you read my mind. So why not?
Because I recognise that whilst I may not be a man in the same way as my brothers, for example, nor am I any longer a woman in the same way as those women who use women-only space.
And do you therefore think it would be better to kind of back off that argument? Because one of the contested areas, particularly with feminists at the moment, or vocal feminists, has been about that space and who has the right to occupy a space, whether it's a public lavatory, a changing room, places which have been reserved for one or the other sex. You're challenging that idea, and at the same time you're saying, well, I would actually stand back from it. I don't think it's right for me.
There's a difference between women's only space and changing rooms and toilets. I mean, toilets are, for Christ's sake, we should all be able to go to the toilet in peace and quiet and in privacy. That's all that's required. All we need is decent locks on doors and respect. Anybody can make toilets gender neutral. Lots of universities do, including my own university. We don't have an issue or a problem.
I agree. I'm sorry, I'm just rushing you, but that is a practical way round that. But I think what it gets to is that there's a difference, isn't there, between what you identify as and self-identification, where a lot of people, I think, will be going along the line with your argument and our first witness, and the one that says, and when I have made that decision, then others have to agree with it. Do you see any space for disagreement here? Or
I've
is
lived
it a
with
slam dunk
disagreement
case?
all my life, so accepted that, of course, there are spaces where disagreement exists. I'm not trying to enforce my version of living on anybody else. Vice versa, I don't expect anybody else to dictate to me how I should live. And that's what you're suggesting. You are suggesting that somebody else should determine whether I am the person I am, or anybody else for that matter. And one of the problems is this has been medicalised in the past, and we're increasingly acknowledging, and James had a point here, that actually it's not diagnosable per se. It is something that people do ultimately.
Professor Whittle, thank you very much indeed. Our last witness is Dr. Heather Brunskill-Evans, who's a research fellow at King's College London, a feminist campaigner, author of the new book Transgender, Children and Young People. I gather that Trans Lobby call you a TERF, which stands for a Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. What on earth is that, and why don't they like you?
I would like to say I'm not singled out for this pejorative term. Anyone who critiques transgender doctrine tends to be called a TERF. I'd also like to point out I don't exclude anyone at all, and I'm very happy for people to decide that they're transgender, that that's their identity. So I think perhaps the question should be asked back to them as to why they would call someone like me a TERF. Can I also point out that I'm a joint editor of the book with my colleague, Professor Michelle Moore.
Mona Siddiqui?
Yeah.
Dr. Evans, why do you think that so many young, progressive, liberal-minded youngsters or teenagers or young people are buying into the transgender doctrine, as you put it?
Well, it's become it's very popular now, and it's equated. I think it's become equated with an idea of progressivism, liberalism, and that it actually allows people to be who they genuinely are, which are all fine principles, which I agree with. But I just don't think the transgender doctrine actually facilitates that. I think it's rather reactionary doctrine, actually.
So, in your view, should a progressive society not identify or ask us to identify that as either male or female, or terms such as masculinity and femininity?
I think a genuinely progressive society would allow boys and girls to be whatever they want to be. So I'm absolutely perfectly happy if boys want to wear dresses. I see that's not a problem. Girls wear trousers. The problem becomes when we decide that that child is genuinely, internally, in some sense, not a boy but a girl, and that's where we get into trouble. So I don't believe that there's anything wrong with a boy's body.
But if
he wants to wear a dress,
is saying that it's not just about wearing a dress, I actually don't feel right in this body.
No, I understand children do that, but I think that we must look at this issue within a social context. I don't think it was the case that 50 years ago, children were saying, "I'm really a girl." I think what happens is socially we have narratives around gender, and small children pick up what these narratives are, and they gender non-conforming children have lived throughout many centuries.
Yes, but people
it's
who
how
don't,
the language we use to describe it now.
People who sexuality is on a huge spectrum. There are men, there are women, there are people with both sexual organs. There are all kinds of people. It's not that this is suddenly emerged in the last 10, 20 years.
I disagree with you completely about that.
No, the conversation about it has emerged, but precisely because we're recognising that people have rights. It doesn't matter how they identify themselves.
I'm absolutely for everyone's rights.
But you're
not against
constraining
that.
it by saying that it's all right to wear a dress, but that doesn't mean that you need to reassign your body.
No, I don't think so. I think it's the transgender doctrine which is constraining. What actually happens is a small child is told that there is something not quite right with its body, and it's actually got the brain or is really another the other gender. And I think that that's very difficult for children. I think we're imposing. I think it's abusive actually, and I think we're imposing restrictions on children. We should be able to be as fluid and to be who we are without making that a problem of the male body or the female body.
Matthew Tan?
Could I just...
No, you can't.
Okay.
We just haven't got time for you to go on, I'm afraid. Matthew Taylor.
What a shame. I would have loved to have.
You're doing very well. Matthew.
I wonder whether you accept that in responding to human suffering, we need to deal with the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be. So if people are suffering here and now in the world, we need to deal with that in the world as it is. Yes?
No.
Well, so just you do accept that principle. So
Of course.
the reason I want to establish that is that modern feminism has made great progress, both for women and for men. But still, most women choose to be generally feminine, and most men choose generally to be masculine. It is a choice now. It's not just social norms. That is a choice that people make.
We always make choices within the context of social norms,
but
actually. But
the norms are less strong than they used to be, so
Yeah.
it is more of a choice. In such a world, the fact that somebody feels that their gender and their identity are not aligned, shouldn't they be free to realign their agenda with their identity?
Of course they should. And the problem with this kind of discussion is that it falls into sort of dichotomous categories here, where you're either pro-trans or anti-trans. I'm absolutely behind anyone who wants to define themselves in whichever way they want, if they're an adult. The problem then becomes, for me, what we're actually doing with children. And I think what is happening is really serious, and that we need a public debate about it, and the alleged science which props up the idea that boys and girls have different kinds of brains and so on. It's a very spurious. It's scientism rather than science.
Out of interest, when you say a child, what is the age you have to reach in order to be able to say I would like a conversation about whether or not my identity and gender are aligned correctly? 10, 12, 7, 14? What, you know?
I'm not going to answer your question in the way that you posed it, because I think that what actually happens is that what children do, children experiment with identity all the time. We know this. They experimented with identity before the trans narrative emerged, and we allow them to experiment. That's the most humane thing to do. So, as Claire said earlier, if a child decides that it's an astronaut, one can play along with this. Well, it doesn't have to moralise about it, but quite clearly the child is not an astronaut. One doesn't go along with the story. In fact, it's incumbent upon adults who are responsible for the welfare, psychological and social and medical, of children not to go along with this story.
Dr. Evans, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you very much.
So where did we get to? Our first witness, Jane Fay, the accidental activist, reckoned nothing happened to children until 16, but and that what does happen to some children is delaying puberty. But she said that had minimal consequences. Do you go along with that, Claire?
I think that she was a very compelling witness, but it was disingenuous to not recognise what's happening at the moment, as our last witness, in fact, discussed, which is that there is a mood and an atmosphere such that institutions, many of them schools and educational institutions, are now going along with the idea that what we've got to do is to talk to children about gender all the time. And I was trying to draw out, and didn't do it as articulate as our last witness, that you then end up with a narrative where the confusions of childhood are put actually through the gender prism and given some kind of way that you actually can't escape. So never mind whether you get hormones or not, my fear is that we're actually imposing on the young a version of reality that's not real in many instances.
I mean, I have to say that I entered this debate really not sure what I thought at all. But as the conversation has gone on, as we listen to the witnesses, my view has hardened, because I can't help noticing in this debate that the critics of the trans movement systematically understate the processes you have to go through, the discussions you have to go through on this process. They tend to conflate a conversation about your identity with people's decision to actually change their sex. They exaggerate how big the threats are. They exaggerate how big the practical problems involved in this are. And I thought Jane Fay, rather like Professor Whittle, helped us to understand that we are perhaps exaggerating the perils associated with people making these choices.
And on that, and on her comparison with taking drugs to delay puberty with contraception.
Well, you see, I think there is a danger when the evidence base is still pretty slight, simply because of the numbers and the number of years that a large number of people have been going through. And now I'm talking here specifically about gender reassignment, just to be clear, not on identifying as. That I don't think that one can know that. And naturally enough, if you're on that side of the argument, you will tend to say the risks are small. And if you're on the other side, you're possibly, as Matthew says, likely to state them more strongly. So I don't think we know enough about that. I was interested by Jane Fay in another way, that although it seems very specific and it's a funny territory, and I think we sometimes struggle to get our heads around some of the language in it, but it's a lot of the argument is very similar to the one that we've had many times about age of criminal responsibility, and that the age at which X or Y becomes desirable or we feel is morally sustainable. I think she said 16 at some point. I think at that point the argument was being led by the drugs, but I thought that was an interesting example. Trouble being, of course, that does hit time of often peak other teenage confusions, as I know, keeping them at home. So I think that sort of brought home to me that we were in a very
you said that with great feeling, Anne.
Moral period here.
Yeah, Mona, our second witness, Mr. James Caspian, the psychotherapist. This was the nub of it all. He's talking about these greater numbers of teenage girls who've had hormone treatment. Some have had double mastectomies and are regretting it now. And when you look at the research, they had often multiple mental health issues as well. Did that not give you pause?
Not really,
for
because it didn't
concern?
answer the question as to what are the right reasons to transition.
That's true. True.
And I think that there is evidence on the other side as well to show that people don't take this lightly. Why would somebody want to say, somebody who's a young boy or a young girl say, I don't feel like a girl, I want to change, I feel like a boy.
Well,
this is a huge issue.
He was suggesting because they already had rather more complex identity issues.
But I think that to dismiss so much of this as mental health problems actually defeats the whole debate. Because then as soon as these are mental health issues, you actually sweep the whole debate under the carpet. And for me, the issue was we don't really understand a lot of this. And I think there's a lot of people who are making judgments about how other people feel and actually switching it and saying, you shouldn't feel like that. But who am I to say to somebody, you shouldn't feel like that, because in 5 years' time, you will regret feeling like that.
That's what Professor Whittle said. Sorry, Claire.
I don't think society should be organised around how people feel myself. I don't think that gives you
most
rights.
Of society is organised.
Well, I think that's wrong. But what I think is important is this point about whether we're underestimating or over, and nobody would do this lightly. See, that's why we're debating this, because the law is changing so that you can likely self-declare and change your identity.
But that presumes that everybody's going to come and self-declare as...
But the whole point being that there's an increasing number of young people who now say that they are not happy in their own body. You're saying maybe they weren't able to do that before. The argument is that actually we're encouraging that atmosphere. We're actually encouraging young people to say that they can self-declare. And you go into the realm of post-factual madness. You can change your birth certificate when you're a man to say that you were born a girl, even though you weren't born a girl.
Anne?
This is completely ridiculous.
Anne?
You were on a roll there. But post-factual madness or not, I'm just reminded that it's very much almost to a fault 19th century utilitarianism here. That it's what the risk, if you're perceiving the risk as if there is remorse, or what you casually call buyer's remorse on one side of the argument, how do you weight that against the opportunities of people, and Mona and Matthew have just said, being able to feel and live as they wish. It is always a tricky moral decision, but that's why it is a real maze. You can't just get around it lightly.
Look, just as I thought that Jane Fay and Professor Whittle reassured us about some of the rather exaggerated claims that are made about the movement, I thought Mr. Caspian and Dr. Brunskill-Evans rather betrayed their position, because I'm afraid Mr. Caspian is either not being honest with us or with himself. It sounded very clearly to me as though he thinks that on the whole the decision to change your gender is pathological, and that's something that he wants to try to demonstrate. And Dr. Brunskill-Evans, well, you know, with the fact that he couldn't answer the question, what is the right reason? The right reason.
He doesn't want to transition himself.
You can answer it, obviously.
And then Dr. Brunskill-Evans basically argued that anyone, as far as I can see, up to the age of 18, who wants to raise this issue must be suffering from false consciousness, because they have been told that this is the case. And then she comes up with this absurd idea that declaring yourself an astronaut, which is an objective status, is the same as declaring your identity, which is a subjective status.
Okay, Claire? Briefly on that.
Yes. So one's identity, one can declare it away. We're talking about whether society should organise around young people self-declaring, and that we look at something that's factually not true and we go along with it just because they feel that that's what we should do. And you've got to remember the toxic atmosphere around this issue. A professor, an academic on who can't do the research, people being called TERFs at the drop of a hat, university campuses where people can't speak because they're called transphobic. But the issue is the context in which young people are growing up, in which if you challenge somebody who says, I am a boy, or I want to change my gender like that, if you even challenge them to think again, you're called transphobic.
And really, one of the wider issues that we touched on earlier on, the way society has to change. Professor Whittle, who is a trans man, said he wouldn't go into women-only space. That would solve that problem, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would for him. I mean, clearly others feel differently about it. But I think what he seemed to be saying, I didn't put words in his mouth after the event, but he seemed to be saying that he accepted that he was a man in a different sense. And there are many others in the movement who simply don't accept that. And that's where that clash comes with feminism. Because in the end, you know, this is a sort of competition for moral space, literally moral space, as it turns out, in the changing room. But that's why it seems like a trivial example. But it's really about what rights and entitlements flow from you identifying as one thing or another. That's not so easy to fudge just by saying everyone has the same rights.
Very briefly, Matthew.
I said at the outset that I think the starting point should be to trust people to make the right choices for themselves, and I think I believe that more strongly now than I did 45 minutes ago.
Oh, too briefly. Mona?
I think that all of us should be less dogmatic and actually say that we should have the moral courage to say that we don't get this, but that it's better to err on the side of empathy.
Claire, I'll leave the very much last word to you.
The world's gone mad, and we should at least be able to challenge it when we think that people are not speaking the truth.
OK, panel, thanks. That's it for this week. From our panel, Anne McElvoy, Claire Fox, Mona Siddiqui and Matthew Taylor. And from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.